All right, hello everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for coming out today. I'm just going to go over some housekeeping, and then once I'm done with that, I'll kind of introduce the first speaker. So firstly, the bathrooms are located on the other end of that white building over there, that summer kitchen, if you need them. And then that first post right there of the house does currently have a hornet's nest kind of building its home in there. So I would just kind of give it a wide berth unless you want a really memorable trip out today. And once we wrap up today, we are going to be offering that standard house tour at about 2 p.m. So you can get your tickets inside at the visitor center. We'll hand out those chips and then start that around then. But so we're going to be hearing from two professors today. First off, we have Dr. Higham, and she focuses mostly on Native American and American history. She wrote Noble, Wretched, and Redeemable, The Civil War in the West, co-authored Conquest and Consequences, The West from Frontier to Region, and co-authored One West, Two Myths, Volume 1 and 2. She's currently working on finishing up a couple other novels as well, or books right now. So she will get to talk to you about you a little bit on that. And then we're also going to be joined by Dr. Bryant, who focuses research on the Cherokee Nation and educational programming, highlighting Indigenous history and collaborative events as well. So we'll have the chance to hear from him secondly. And both will kind of do a Q&A after they kind of finish up their lecture. So I'm going to let Dr. Higham take it over, and then I'll be available after for any questions about the site as well. So just find me. But I'll welcome Dr. Higham now.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I have a big voice because I teach big classes. So I'd like to thank Molly for inviting me, for everyone for coming out on this hot, lovely day. So what I'd like to talk about today is settler Cherokee interactions around the time the house was founded. What I'm going to do is give you some background about how Cherokee society was changing between 1700 and 1792, and to talk about ways historians disagree about what those changes were and what those changes mean. So one of the things I always tell my students is that in many ways during this period, the Cherokee were actively participating in the creation of Southern culture, and settlers were actively participating in the creation of Southern culture. There was not Southern culture outside of Cherokee and settlers, so it was, the South included Cherokees and settlers. And when I talk about settlers, I'm going to have to explain that some of the settlers would be British settlers and some of the settlers would be American settlers, and there's not like a magical line between them. So they're actually harder to talk about than when I talk about the Cherokee. When we're talking about the Cherokee, we're talking about two specific groups, which would be, and I lost it on here. Where is it? There are two specific groups to the towns near the Hiawassee River and near the Conolusky. So they are more distinct and more identifiable to historians than settlers are, because settlers who were British one day were American another day. Settlers who did not consider themselves British were technically British, so it gets more confusing as we go on. So I want you to consider two words that I'm going to use throughout this presentation. One of them is the term assimilation, which historians use to mean a forced cultural change. So what would be an example of a forced cultural change?
Religion.
Pardon?
Religion? Like practice religion?
Not necessarily, because it has to be forced. So, I mean, we'll get into whether religion can be forced.
Traffic laws.
Traffic laws, it's not really cultural, it's legal. Yes. So like the residential schools and all of that. And so the residential schools that happen, and we're going to talk about missionary schools, some of them qualify for assimilation, some of them do not, because it depends on how people get there. So the example I always give my students is the Marines. You arrive, they shake your head, they start calling you by your last name, they make you do things on their rules, at their time, there's no choice. That's a forced cultural change. I used to teach at Texas A&M University, and their freshman orientation, they took all the freshmen, all 5,000 of them, to a camp for 4 days. They took away their cell phones, and they taught them everything it meant to be an adult. When you see a professor, you say hello. When you see a professor, you stick your hand out, and all of this. So that's a forced cultural change. So that's assimilation. Acculturation is a cultural change that it can be a two-way street or is one that's done by choice. So what are examples of acculturation? And religion can be acculturation. If you choose to start going to church and pick up some of those habits. What are examples of acculturation? When have you changed your life in a way that you consciously made that choice?
You get married.
When you get married, that's a good one. I told my daughter that.
Parenting.
Hmm?
Parenting.
Parenting? The acculturation, Molly?
I started saying y'all when I moved to this house. So
Okay, yeah.
I didn't say it before moving here. So.
And that's, all of these are excellent examples of acculturation tends to be more subtle, and it tends to be a two-way street, too. People that you're becoming, you're saying y'all, and your roommates might pick up something from you. So acculturation tends to be more of a two-way street. So some of the changes I'm going to talk about that happened to the Cherokee in this region over the 1700s that gets us to this point, I want you to think as I talk about them whether they're assimilation or acculturation, because historians debate which way they go, because they aren't always so simple. So the things I'm going to talk about are the effects of the deer trade, the change in gender roles, and then the invitation to missionaries around 1790 to 1800, and how those all changed Cherokee life as they started to share this space with settlers, which I think is how I'm going to go through. So, the Cherokee are easy to define. They're the middle towns along the Little Tennessee River, the valley towns along the Hiawassee and the Valley River, and the out towns along the Tuckasegee and the Oconaluftee rivers. So they had shared language, shared cultural structures, and shared political structures, but there was differentiation between these different groups. How they lived, how they practiced. So just like we have regional differences within the U.S., we have similar regional differences. So when I talk about, and that means they also adopted and adapted, assimilated and acculturated in different ways depending on the groups. Now, like I said, the British and the Americans are a bit more difficult because they're mushy. So I always tell my students that figuring out who's British and who's American is like the old Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, where they would put, Calvin says to Hobbes, I'm going to show you how to make toast. And he puts bread in and the toast pops out, and Hobbes turns to him and says, where'd the bread go? So that's sort of what happens with the British and the Americans. Suddenly people start identifying as Americans, but they were British just a few days ago or just a few years ago. So for historians, those terms are kind of messy between 1776 and 1789 because things have not sorted. And there are the people, like some of the people who settle around Kings Mountain, some of the people who go over the mountains after the regulator fight in the 1760s, who go into what is now Tennessee, who live amongst the Cherokee and identify as white Indians. Cherokee don't identify them that way, but they do not want to be British because they don't want to have to live under British rule. They don't want to have to pay British taxes. And then when the Americans come along, same deal. They do not want to have to live under those laws. So they're a little harder to talk about. So, I will fudge a little and say settlers, and we'll hope they're American and whatever. So, what I'm going to start with is the deer trade. And the deer trade was one of the biggest changes that came to the Cherokee in the 1700s. So in the early 1700s, Cherokee towns tended to be compact, homogeneous, centered around townhouses, and built for defense. So they were also organized around mother towns, so there would be smaller towns, but then there would be these mother towns that people migrated back to at different points. So they were built for protection from other native groups and from European groups. They were built to keep people out. By the end of the 1700s, Cherokee towns are sprawling, often moved to along river bottoms, often a mix of fields and housing, often farmsteads with trading posts, and they were built for trade and interaction. And a couple of things led to this, and the biggest thing that led to this was the commercialization of the deer. So the Cherokee had always dealt in deer pelts, but once the French, and we always forget the French are here, once the French and the Spanish to the south, and the English come in and start really battling deer pelts, the Cherokee begin to hunt deer more efficiently, and they start giving up certain crops and everything to be able to hunt deer. So at one point, Charleston was averaging 50,000 deer pelts a year, That's a lot of deer pelts. And that's just one of the places that they got transported to. Can I just say, Charleston must have smelled horrible with all those deer pelts sitting on the docks that had traveled over country without being fully treated. So whenever I read those accounts, I just think, I'm glad I wasn't there. People who romanticize that period, I'm like, yeah, thought this out. So as the deer trade became a bigger part of Cherokee economy, it reshaped their politics, their gender roles, and some of their other choices. But it did not reshape it evenly. Different groups chose how much it was going to reshape. So, for instance, those that traded with the English did not like to trade with women. So they preferred to trade with men and made it very clear. They would say, we will not trade with women. To which one of the Cherokee leaders famously said, how can you not like women? Are you not a woman? Do you not have sisters? What's this problem you have with women? Where's this coming from? So the Cherokee prior to the mid-1700s allowed women to serve as beloved men. They allowed women to serve on councils. They had them often served in charge of clans. So they had important political roles. But different groups within the Cherokee adopted the English methods and only sent men to trade, which then undermined women serving on the councils. So some Cherokee became patrilineal, putting power and economic power in the hands of men. Others remained matrilineal, keeping women on councils and keeping women as part of the trade. This causes some significant cultural changes. And by the 1760s, when the deer trade collapses because of overhunting, driven by the European markets, a series of wars break out between the Cherokee, between other native groups, between the Cherokee and English Cherokee. There's people who think they want to become Americans, and there's a lot of warfare in this region. And those groups that had become patrilineal saw their societies crumble. Because who gets killed in wars? Men. And so there were not women in the place to continue to have the institutional memory, have the economic drive, have the political drive. So the groups that had become patrilineal saw their societies crumble more than the groups that had remained matrilineal. And that shapes how much those groups recover and how quickly they recover. The groups that had remained matrilineal tended to remain more diverse in their economic, expanding more crops, and had started edging towards both cash crops and staple crops. Now, cash crops come with a downside. What's the downside to cash crops? Not currency. Currency is deer pelts right now, which is one other problem. What do people in the South do when they grow cash crops? Who do they use? Slaves. There we go. Look at that. Got all audience participation. So some of the Cherokee groups, some individual Cherokees, some Cherokee groups and specifics started adopting chattel slavery as they adopted it. And other groups were very opposed to that. So there's internal conflict going on between these Cherokee groups. Remember, it's not until about the early 19th century that the Cherokee see themselves as a united cultural group. They see themselves as almost a confederacy with different areas making their own choices, culturating and assimilating in different ways. So there was differences within them, which drives my students nuts because they think, oh, this will be easy. I'll just take a class on the Cherokee. It'll be simple. And then about halfway through, they're like, why is this so hard? Why is European history hard? Just welcome, just embrace it. So this change of the deer trade changed the towns. They had to add cash and staple crops. They had to make their towns more welcoming to trade. And so this is one of the things we see the trade going into. Because you have the increase in warfare and politics, the change in politics, because some have become patrilineal and some matrilineal, you have different groups shift in power structures. Those that were matrilineal seem to rise out of this period with a bit more power because their economic and political decisions are more stable. Those that had become more patrilineal had started adopting warriors into the council who traditionally had not been on councils, and they seemed to see more disruption within their economics and politics. So if you're standing here in 1788 and you're a British/American settler your neighbors around you are Cherokee are in a bit of a transitional period. And this may be why white British American settlers were moving in, because there was this conflict, and that gave them a way into the area. But many of the Cherokee recognized the threat that was coming from European, well, let's be specific, from English and Americans. So the French, everyone forgets, the French are still here. The French are still on the other side of the Atlantic. The French are still trading with groups in North Carolina past the American Revolution. But the French have a very different way of trading. And the way the British are, our way or the highway, don't send women to trade with us. You must trade with us in English. We don't learn your language. The French are like, the French literally tell their traders beginning in the 1600s to adopt a policy of métissage, which means intermarriage. Catholic Church actually came up with it. Hey, the best way to do this is to intermarry with them. So they drop their traders off and say to them, learn the native language, learn everything you can about the society, make some blood ties, aka make some children, learn how this society works, and set things up on their standards. I had a student do a brilliant paper 2 years ago where he looked at maps from French and Indian War, and he compared French maps and British maps. And what he discovered is the British renamed everything in British terms, but the French kept the native terms. And this explains why when he was reading the records of the British military, they kept getting lost and missing things, because when they got lost, they'd ask people, where's work, whatever, and they'd be like, we don't know if we're like that, but we do know. Can't think about it. We do know Tawanda, and they'd be like, what's Tawanda? Well, Tawanda is what they were calling Fort King George or whatever, but that's what the native peoples in the French call. So sometimes assimilation bites you when people won't participate. So the French acculturated to native societies. Doesn't mean they did other things like introduce diseases and stuff, but they acculturated, and that's how they ran an empire with so many French. The British assimilated more, but there is some choice, obviously, because some Cherokee choose not to assimilate. So this brings us to 1788 to 1803, which is where the Cherokee in this region and in Georgia reach out to an unusual group. And that group, the man who mentioned religion, is missionaries. They reached out to the Moravians, of course, to not speak English, but they wanted to better understand the settlers. Now, if you read, as my first book was on Protestant missionaries see this as the Cherokee and any other native group that requests missionaries, as them understanding that Christianity is superior to all other religions and civilizations. If you're an ethnohistorian, this is a sign that the Cherokee see they need the skills of English and understanding the ways and cultures and politics of these other groups. And what better way than to invite them in and ask them to establish schools? Now, if you're a white American settler in 1792 and you live in this area, the one place you see other people is a church. And church acts as the trading posts, as the government offices, and as the place you make deals. And we have records that demonstrate that the Cherokee and the Catawba and other groups recognize that, and that's one reason they invite missionaries in. Because missionaries give them a way into it. So one of the great red herrings in my field is whether any native North American truly converted to Christianity. And I call that a red herring because nobody knows but the Christian God whether somebody actually converted. I think, and by the way, none of the missionaries I've ever read truly believe that anyone who's not of European descent truly converted. African, Native American, they never believe they truly converted. But what's more interesting to me is this understanding that you are going to have new neighbors and you need to understand those new neighbors to be able to deal with those new neighbors. You need to understand their ways of doing things so that you can explain things to them in their terms, deal with them on their terms, and come to these agreements. So the Moravians are the first ones in, and they're not as helpful because they don't speak English. By 1803, you start having Presbyterians and Congregationalists come in, and they're very excited that their schools fill and confused as to why their churches don't. And I think that's the best sign of what the Cherokee and other groups were out of this. They wanted to pick up what they needed and be able to use those tools to continue to live as Cherokee while making those choices. So, for instance, the Cherokee by 1803 start subdividing what becomes known as the Cherokee Nation into districts and starts using a police force. And by 18, maybe they don't tell me the date on this, I'm sure. I'll just say in the 18 teens, or 20s, they start mandatory schooling amongst the Cherokee. So that is way before any American colony has done that or state. They're adopting this because they want to look like the white settlers around them, so those white settlers will treat them like they want to be treated, which is as a nation and as an entity that gets to control its own country. So that is how the interactions are going in this time. The Cherokee are not trying to become civilized, which is why they're called the 5 civilized tribes. They're trying to present themselves in a way that their new neighbors / conflict will recognize them as people who have a right to choose their own destiny. So the question I have for you of these examples that you gave are which one of these are acculturation and which one of these are assimilation? And I'll take any brave people who want to make choices.
Well, if they're choosing to go to schools, that's acculturation.
That's correct. Yes, that would be acculturation. So, but then the question, then we trickle down. If they continue to speak English, is that acculturation? If the Americans will only deal with them if they speak English, is that acculturation? If they stay bilingual, I mean, after all, the Cherokee created their own syllabary so that they could have a written language. The Cherokee Phoenix was written in both syllabary and English. But there are people in the Cherokee who remained Cherokee-only speakers, and people would say, well, they're not really civilized because English is the civilized language. So one of my missionaries that I studied for my dissertation said, the language of the Bible, English. That's news to me. So. Interesting. Other examples, other possibilities. What's assimilation and what's acculturation amongst this? Where are the Cherokee choosing? Where are they being forced? So when I do this exercise with my students, acculturation seems really simple, right? It's forced. But how it's forced. So historians really debate whether the shift to paternalism paternalistic society is because the British are only dealing with men or not. Are they making the choice, okay, to do trade, we're going to have to send a man. Well, now that he has this power, shouldn't he have a voice in the council? It's a fine line. And it's changed. Yes?
It'd be a have to. I mean, if it's a have to, then it would be assimilation. Like the Cherokee learn English because the British are saying, if you want to deal with us, you can learn English. That sounds like that's a have to. That sounds more like assimilation than acculturation because if they want to do, they have their choice. They don't want to learn.
So in many cases you can say have to, but in that case, some historians will argue some of the Cherokee choose not to deal with the British anymore, they only deal with the French.
Or the Germans, the Moravian Germans.
Yeah, the Moravian Germans, or in some cases farther south, the Spanish. So the have to may be very narrow, and historians traditionally, before like the 1990s, really focused in on, well, if Europeans are doing it, it must be required. Missing that the Cherokee are being very conscious about how what's the have to I have to do. A friend of mine has a great line that I tell students all the time. People only make the choices they had historically, not the choices we want. And when a student says to me, well, if I lived in this time period, I would have next, like that was not a choice. So people do, so you have to look at the moment, like what are their choices? What is a have to, and what is a maybe have to, and what is a don't have to? So I saw another hand up. Yes?
If they become dependent on the deer trade for their livelihood, where does that fall?
So that's a good question. And that's one of the ones that gets, I use an essay in my class, the students get very frustrated with. Is the deer trade culturation or assimilation? Is it a moment where the Cherokee show themselves not to be environmentalists or the environmentalists anyway? The deer trade's really tough because they become somewhat dependent on European goods, and the Europeans start saying we won't take currency, we won't take anything else to trade but deer pelts. And they've stopped growing some of their own staple crops, so they have to trade for staple crops. The French have a very different way of dealing with this. The French create these mini plantations where they bring in enslaved Africans and they grow traditional Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw crops and trade deer pelts and other things with them. Because, as one of the French seigneurs says, the women process deer pelts better than anybody else, but they're also in charge of agriculture. So if we can ease the burden of women, we will get more lands. So the French are making this very conscious choice. The British are, they don't know how to farm, they don't have fences. The British are very difficult. So they're also the last ones to come in. So that's another thing to keep in mind. By the time the British get here, the Cherokee dealt with the Spanish and French, as well as the Choctaw, the Catawba, the Yamasee. The list goes on. So they were very good diplomats. They were very good at making their own destiny and making their own choices. So, questions? And we're going to run over. Questions? Comments? Yes?
What was the Native American tribe that was here within 5 miles?
So, Cherokee and Catawba. And it's there. I spent a lot of time tracking this down. It's very necessary. One of the great problems we have is that the British who are here are sloppy about identifying who's here. They tend to use the term Indian, or in their records they tend to say Cherokee for everybody, unless they're from what is now the Charlotte area when they just say Catawba. So many Cherokee claim this area as part of their Cherokee. So I focused on the Cherokee because we have less. The Catawba are vastly understudied, particularly in North Carolina, and so I focused on the Cherokee so I could instead of a lot of Indians, perhaps. So yes.
Where did the Tuscarora fit in?
So the Tuscarora, the last I knew, there's been a long debate about whether the Tuscarora came down or went up. But the Tuscarora are related linguistically and culturally to the Iroquois Confederacy. And there's a debate about whether they came down from the Iroquois Confederacy or went up and joined the Iroquois Confederacy. So they are linguistically and culturally different than other groups around at this point. So that's how they work.
And in the time frame, were they at the same time as the Cherokee and Catawba, or
yes.
before or later?
They're farther east.
Further east.
You know, the Miami are beginning to work their way down into this area, Miami Confederacy. But again, the records are, you know, when the British have a conflict with someone, they don't stop and say, "Excuse me, who are you belong to?" They're like, "Those Indians." So, or the enemy Indians. So, other questions? Yes.
So were the Indians, whether they were Catawba or Cherokees, using that part of the state, years of experience,
So no, the Cherokee are part of the Trail of Tears, and there are basically 4 waves of the Trail of Tears, which I won't get into, but I'd happy to go back and talk about the complexity of the Trail of Tears. The Catawba made a deal with South Carolina as a state to become a state-sponsored tribe, which got them out of the federal Indian Removal Act because they were no longer a federally recognized tribe. They now, the state of South Carolina is now their in charge of it. And so they were exited out of that and allowed to remain, but they had just swapped a ton of land for that right. And by the time of the Civil War, they realized they were sort of trapped. And they had incredible pressures on them. And on. And then just after the Civil War, the Catawba become Mormon as an attempt to try and break with the state of South Carolina. In the 20th, 21st century, they've worked their way back to try to get federal recognition, which is incredible. Because they didn't talk to any historians before they came up with rules for federal recognition. That's what it was. Yes.
This is just more of an information bit, but right now we're using a MART, which is no charge. There is a whole Virgil Ortiz exhibit. He's a Southwestern Native American futuristic artist honor. But upstairs is all this exhibition on the catawbas.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, photographs and pieces of work. It's really, really fun.
The catawbas have sort of, I've been in the Charlotte area 23 years, and the Catawba have been reclaiming their history at a rapid rate. It's still, I had a student try to write an honors thesis on the Catawba this year, and you just run into big holes where stuff just isn't well preserved, or if it is, you don't know what it is. So, yes.
I think I know what the answer is going to be, but I'd like to hear you speak to why, where the Cherokee seem to have a better, more intelligent approach to the situation. Why should we have an intelligent approach? How do the British become continental conquerors?
So you have to keep in mind that the British, it takes them a long time to be continental conquerors. They arrive in 1619, and they still are. Time of the Revolution, they're sending George Washington to negotiate with the Cherokee. So the Cherokee are still holding firm. They make most of their inroads. I mean, if you look at the problem with the British is they drew North Carolina all the way to the Mississippi River. They are nothing if not confident, but they actually don't make as far in as people realize. I mean, they are barely hitting Charlotte by the 1750s. They haven't had to fight their way across the city. And much of what takes the groups out in front of them is not that the British have superior methods or guns or anything. It's disease and economic destruction. It takes the people down every year. So it's, I had a student ask a great question in a discussion group I had. Like, what if the British had succumbed to a native disease? How different would American history be? Well, probably wouldn't be speaking English. I'll tell you that much. Probably might be speaking French or Cherokee or any number of things. So, just those circumstances that lead to. So, that's another. Yes.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a lot of intermarriage with Cherokee.
Yes, and I skipped over. So, starting in the mid 1750s through the deer trade, particularly the groups that remain matrilineal, they don't encourage, but they are more than happy to have their women marry British, Scottish, Irish traders, which is where you get names like Ross and Pendergrass and McLeish and stuff start showing up in the Cherokee. The Cherokee this time only see two groups of people. You're either Cherokee or you're not. Either your mother's Cherokee or she's not. If your mother's Cherokee, you're a Cherokee. Doesn't matter who you're from. If you're adopted and a woman claims you as their adopted child, you're Cherokee. Full stop. None of this quarter half stuff that the British, who actually lifted it from Spanish from the Inquisition, and that's a whole other lecture. But so there is more intermarriage during this time period. There's a scholar named Faye Yarborough who did a fascinating study of this. So by the time we get to the 19th century, the Cherokee start regulating intermarriage, and you have to get permission to intermarry. If you're a man, very few women marry into the Cherokee, otherwise they don't marry. So like women, not that I say that. The men have to sign away their rights as American citizens. They have to agree to live under Cherokee law, on and on and on. What Faye Yarborough went in looking for is you had to have testimonials from 2 to 3 Cherokees saying you were a good guy. And what she expected, because this happens in other situations, is that we would see the same people writing testimonials for all the Scottish and British traders and farmers. That's not what happened. It's the young woman's brothers and cousins who write. It's very diverse. So they're the ones, so it very much is by choice. And Cherokee marriage through this period is still the woman's choice, but she was just gobsmacked that, if I'm getting married, my brothers are saying, yeah, he's a good guy, this is who she's chosen, and go with it. It's not what we see after the Dawes Act, which is one of the projects I'm working on. We see the same people writing over and over again, the federal government saying, oh no, this white man's a good guy, that's why he's marrying this Lakota woman or this Osage woman, and so it's okay for him to have access to her trustee money in her land. It's the same people writing the same letter over and over. And that's what we found with Cherokee. So again, is that acculturation or assimilation? It's probably acculturation. The women see something in these men that they see in something. It's not the Brothers Nicholas, it's exotic food. Who knows? One more question because I want to finish Dr. Bryant's time. But I'm happy to talk to people afterwards. Any other questions? Thank you so very much.
Shio Nagata, Doha Nove Te Wado Ida, Shki. Hello, everybody. My name is Alan Bryant, and thank you for having me and allowing me to speak today. That was a traditional Cherokee greeting. I'm guessing you're looking at me thinking that he's pale enough to actually see all the way through him. So, but my grandfather, Russell Norris, was born and raised in the Big Cove community of the Palo Valley, Cherokee, North Carolina. So that's I always like to give a traditional greeting, both in his memory, but also in memory of all the Cherokee who had their language stolen from them. My grandfather told a story when he was in third grade. The teacher was passing out quizzes from the day before, and my grandfather got his quiz, and he had made an A. He was very excited that he had made it. He couldn't wait to go home and tell mom and dad. And so it slipped when he looked at his quiz. It just slipped. He said "Stop," which is good in Cherokee. Unfortunately, the teacher heard it, and so when she was finished passing out those quizzes, she took my grandfather into the hallway with a cake of lye soap, and she washed his mouth out, standing at a drinking fountain. So when I speak that, I get a little chill bumps for him. So okay, so glad to be here. My name is Alan Bryant, and really, really grateful for the invitation. I think what I'll do is just kind of piggyback on what we've been talking about, but I want to focus a little bit on the school. On the schools. I'm going to stand here if y'all don't mind. I feel like a Baptist preacher. I'm doing a love offering here. So talk about the schools a little bit, because that's kind of really from the moment my grandfather told me that story, that kind of set me on my scholarship path of what I wanted to study and what I wanted to teach. So the American Revolution there's a direct line from the horrors of the American Revolution to the very first school system, to the very first school that opens at Spring Place, opened up by the Moravians in 1801. They come to Tellico Blockhouse in 1800 to negotiate with the Cherokee and to ask for permission to open a mission. And the mission would be a church, a home for the missionaries, and a school for Cherokee children. One of the questions that I have always been curious about, that we touched on just a moment ago, is why would Cherokee parents willingly send their children to missionary schools? One of the things we know, missionaries complain all the time about no discipline among Cherokee parents, right? I teach at taught before my program was ended. I taught at Cherokee High School for the last 11 years. And sometimes I relate to these missionaries, right? Because if Grandpa wants to take you fishing, you're going fishing, right? And that is, by God, an excused absence. Because the idea is, and I love it, you're going to learn more sitting there with your grandpa by the side of the river than you will ever learn in my class. And I can promise you. Right? That's a guarantee. Even, and I don't mean they're walking through the woods, doing that Indian thing where like, this is sacred powder, I don't even mean that. I mean if they're just sitting there telling stories and fishing, right? So it's still cultural. And so the missionaries would rant and rave, they've come to pick the kids up for stickball again. And stickball's the devil, right? Or they've come to pick their kids up for green corn ceremony, right? Oh, that was a big one because that was just inviting the devil, right, to go to a green corn ceremony. So with these ideas, the question remains, why? Why would you take your child, your Cherokee child? And one thing we know about Cherokee parents and grandparents, their children, that was their life. Right? That was their life. Kids meant everything. So to take it to a white person, to a white missionary, and drop them off, right? And not for the day. Typically, they had to leave their kids there and board them there. This is especially striking because Cherokee is not a Cherokee word. Okay? The Cherokee never referred to themselves as Cherokee. Ever. The Cherokee word for who we are is Ani Yunwiya. Ani Yunwiya. And that means the principal people. Right? Just ethnocentrism is not purely a European problem. The principal people. And the belief, right, the worldview was the Cherokee nation, the Cherokee people were the center of the universe. And everything emanated out from the Cherokee. A little proud there, but that's who you refer to yourselves as. We are the principal people. Everything revolves from us. But we're going to send you our children for you to teach them. It's not complicated, right? It's not complicated as to why did Charles Hicks and Half Killer and James Vann, why were they able? Why did they decide, let's send our kids to a white school? The answer is simple. The answer is desperation. Sheer desperation. And what was going to happen is exactly what you were saying. We're going to build these schools. We're going to send our children to these schools. And we are going to show the world that we're people. We're going to show the world that we're capable. My first year of teaching at Cherokee High School, it was Columbus Day. And I said to my students, I said, you know, my full-time job is I prepare future history teachers. And so I said to my Cherokee kids, I said, what do you want me to go back and tell my future history teachers about you? What do you, on this Columbus Day, what do you want to make sure that future history teachers know about you and your people? The answer staggered me, and I will never forget it. One of my students looked at me and simply said, just tell them we're human. It was only 10 years ago. Just tell them we're human. Right? So the pressure, and remember, removal didn't start with Andrew Jackson. The father of removal is Thomas Jefferson with the Georgia Compact. He may have a beautiful memorial, but Jefferson's the father of removal. So removal is in the air. Get these folks out of here. Move them along. Take their land. Get them across the Mississippi. The Cherokee are trying to prove, no, we can stay. We can be civilized. We can be what you want us to be. Watch. But here's what I want you to consider. That pressure that we can be great. We can be civilized. We can exceed all expectations. Jesus, guys, that pressure fell on their children. Right? We're going to send you to school. Do good. Right? My dad, I used to get out of the car. Be somebody. Yes, sir. Right? He was a drill sergeant, so when I said, yes, sir, I'm in. You got it, sir. I know, the 2 earrings did not please my heart. That was a long day. Let me tell you. And I was coming home from college, and I was still sitting like this. My dad was finally, what's in your ear? Oh. I pulled it down. I will never forget, he just shook his head, and the old drill sergeant said, well, your mom always wanted you. My dad woke. All right. So that pressure falls on these children. Whether we get to stay in our ancestral home will depend on whether you do a good job learning English. Whether we get to continue to visit grandmother's grave depends on how you do in that. right? Whether we get to stand here, where, I mean, when they built the new campus in Cherokee for the high school, middle school, and the elementary school, the discovery was that the Cherokee have been in that area for at least 13,000 years. Just to put that in perspective, next year America turns 250. Woohoo. Right? So, you're having to prove your humanity, and your children are the ones doing it. Your children are the ones writing the letters up north, right? Saying who we are. One of my most, and these things still impact our kids. Elias Boudinot. I had spent, the day before we talked about Elias Boudinot, I had spent the entire day with my high school students talking about how the missionaries changed their names. If you go to Cherokee now, one of my students is running for tribal council, Joy Howell, O-W-L-E. I have taught many kids. Shelby Wolf was a great student, W-O-L-F-E. If it's just an animal name, it's sad. If you put that E on it, you're okay. Right? So I'm talking about how they changed names, took the names away, how you could pay, literally it was called a bounty, and you could rent the child. They would take that child's name and give them your name, or whoever you wanted to name after. So I had this whole class. The next day we're talking about John Ridge and Elias Boudinot. And I keep talking about Elias Boudinot. And at one point I say, his Indian name was Buckwater. He was known as Buckwater. At the end of class, one of my Cherokee students raises his hand. Yes, Gideon? Yesterday you talked about how they kept losing their names, and their names were taken from them, and how serious a betrayal this was. But Dr. Bryant, today, you kept using the missionary name. Why didn't you call him Buck Water? One of those moments as a teacher where you realize, okay, this is why the job is great, because y'all teach me. Right? So Cherokee kids are still thinking about their names, the E at the end of their last name, right? The grandparent who had their name changed at the boarding school. They're still having these conversations. So just as we go through, I just wanted to give you a couple of numbers. By the end of the American Revolution, when we talk about desperation, by the end of the American Revolution, the Cherokee Nation had been reduced by 2/3. So the land that made up the Cherokee Nation by the end of the Revolution is cut by 2/3, 79,000 square miles that were lost by the end. This comes after, I love reading these off, sacred treaties between the Europeans, eventually the Americans, and the Cherokee. These treaties came in 1721, 55, 68, 1770, 72, 73, 75, 77, and 1783. Each one of those was changing something from the last one to get more land, right? Always. By the end of the American Revolution, this is the number that kicks you right in the solar plexus. By the end of the American Revolution, the Cherokee population had been diminished by 50%. Half. Folks, when half of a nation dies, that's genocide. Right? We can play with academic definitions and we can get clever and cute. When 50% of the people are gone, we know what we call it. Right? And so that's what they were confronted when Abraham Steiner of the Moravians showed up and said, "Let us build a school." The irony is the Cherokee could not have been more clear. We will let you build your church. Because in Cherokee cosmology, your faith is your faith. It ain't none of my business. You worship how you worship. You pray as you wish to pray. That's you. That's between you and Creator. That's not me. Or if you don't pray at all, that's between you and nothing? I don't know how that works. That's between you and your conscience, I guess, right? So when the Moravians said, we want to build a Moravian church, the Cherokee said, fine. And anybody who wants to visit your church, great. Anybody who wants to convert, Charles Hicks, right? Charles Hicks, arguably the greatest Cherokee from this era, will convert. He will become a Moravian, right? So build your church, no problem. But the Cherokee were very clear. What we want, what we are literally here asking for is we want a school for our children. The Moravians show up. They build the church immediately. They have their first church service within 12 days of arriving. They will not have their first day of school for another 2 years. Yeah, we know the school. We'll get to you. But meanwhile, come sing a hymn. Right? And so just keep putting them off, keep pushing them back. The Cherokee, however, God love them. Those kids that we talked about, they accomplished more than anybody could have prayed for. They accomplished more than anybody could have dreamed. Go to the Newberry Library in Chicago, and you can sit there and you can read the letters these young Cherokee wrote. You're going to see the beautiful script, right, of handwriting. Then you prepare yourself for what comes next, and you discover several of these little girls who had written these beautiful letters died in the mud on the trail. And then you try to reconcile that. They succeeded, right? The Cherokee kids, the Cherokee parents, they succeeded. It's just that the Americans never kept that promise. George Washington made a promise to his, I think, everlasting credit. George Washington said, I don't want to go down in history as the guy responsible for genocide. Just as he knew he was going down in history. Washington had an ego. But he said, I don't want to go down in history as the man responsible for genocide and slaughter. So he said, let's build schools. We'll civilize them. There was even talk that eventually there would be a state called Cherokee. It would be part of the Union. The Cherokee did their part. The United States government didn't. Cherokee children did their part. The missionaries, the churches didn't. So the Cherokee were operating out of desperation. What were the missionaries operating out of? A sense of, and I use this term very thoughtfully, cultural genocide. And I think that's fair because this is not some tinfoil conspiracy. The missionaries, they told us so. John Gamble, a Moravian missionary, wrote that he had come to erase the Cherokee language. Right? Cyrus Kingsbury, one of the leaders of the ABCFM, he says to his missionaries, we must build a boarding school because only boarding schools will work because we can get them away from the influence of their families and their communities. So they said it. You don't have to take my word, that this is what it is. They said it. It's in their letters. It's in their diaries. And they saw nothing wrong with it. I try, when I get real judgmental, I try to remind myself that as bigoted and racist and ethnocentric as they come across as, I do try to remind myself that John Gamble thought if these people don't listen to me, they will all go to hell for eternity. So I try to be compassionate that maybe his heart was in the right place. I don't always succeed. Okay, so I need to wrap up in case there are any questions or anything. I did want to, I just want to close quickly with kind of a plea to all of you. You're here on a Saturday afternoon listening to us. Evidence would suggest, therefore, you may be a history geek. That might be possible. In case you are, I would like to beg you, don't just be amateurs at this. Speak out. Help us. I don't know if you paid attention or not, but this week, a very famous political pundit said that America's problem was that we did not, quote, kill enough Indians.
Oh.
this week. Got a lot of emails. Got a lot of emails from my former Cherokee students. Did you see this? What do we do with this? I don't know what we do, but I do know history is a powerful corrective to a lot of myths and a lot of conspiracies and those things. I had to call this place this week to say to them, any publicity, any promotion you do, if you mention me, you cannot mention the university where I work. Because I'm talking about genocide and colonialism, and that might be seen as diverse. I'm talking about Indians, and that might be seen as diverse. So I can't even tell you where I work without risk of losing my job. Just for telling you what I told you today. So, we need you. We need you to speak out for our school kids, for our history teachers, for, history. I say accurate history, but one of the fun things about history is how we can fight about it, right? I can tell you Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. That's it. We're done. No more to talk about. Let's talk about whether he was good or bad.
Yeah.
Right? We can be here for hours. We can talk about, the great emancipator. Also the guy responsible for the largest mass execution in all of American history when he had the Dakota 38 hanged for fighting for their own people. Way to go, Abe. Right? Does that mean I don't like Abraham Lincoln? No, it means he's gone. Right? Still a hero of mine, but it's gone. If we're holding out for perfect heroes, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
So, get involved. Do these things. Write letters. Go to school board meetings, even if you don't have kids involved. The young people coming up are going to affect. Woo! Thanks, and Dr. Freud are going to affect all of us. And they deserve good history. They do. And I'm not, for the record, I'm not talking about everybody needs a history that beats up America. No, that's not what I'm saying. Can you know the truth about this country and love this country? Yeah. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I would argue if you love something without knowing the truth about it, that's not love. Otherwise, my high school girlfriend and I would still be Again, weird.
Are there for both of you, are there particular books or authors that you would recommend to us?
Yeah, for the modern Eastern Cherokee, a guy named John Finger.
Finger?
Yes, he is.
John Finger?
Yeah, yes, John Finger. Phenomenal. He wrote a 2-volume history of the EBCI. It ends just before Chief Joyce Newman gets elected, so it ends in 95. But Finger's phenomenal 2 books.
Cool.
And then if you're looking more for the Cherokee stuff around this time period, this era, William McLaughlin is kind of the godfather of it. He's phenomenal. Right? He's tremendous. And then, oh my gosh, Wilkins. Wilkins wrote a book, I think it's called Cherokee Tragedy, and it's about the Ridge family, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. Ridge family is still deeply controversial among the Cherokee. It's a really fair book. I love it.
Tia Miles' book on Joseph Van. It's called It's Very Readable, but it'll make you think more.
Miles?
Miles, M-I-L-E-S. It's really good, fair look at Joseph Van. Is a very complicated person. That's what makes history fun. People are complicated.
Yeah.
So McLaughlin, of course, if you want a tough read that challenges our understanding of Cherokee removal Claudio Sant, SKU, Unworthy Republic, that argues that the final push for removal is based on the expansion of plantations. And he went through hundreds of local newspapers and editorials and found planters saying, our land is dying, we need the Indian land, they're not using it right. But it's a tough read because he's a very complicated writer. Bless his heart. I went to graduate school with him. He's really, really smart and he's angry that no one's smart. Oh, coffee. Coffee's the one that's just sucking the soil. And so they look at the Cherokee farms.
Well, isn't part of the problem unsustainable farming practices of the Europeans? I mean, they kind of did it to themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I had the college who's they wrote 3 books on wine,
Yeah.
which we enjoy teasing them about.
Yes, ma'am.
Are the Eastern, how are the Eastern Bandit Cherokees and the Cherokee Nation, how are they connected?
They're still close. They have an annual council gathering, and then every 4 years they have a gathering in Red Lake, Georgia. No, sorry, Tennessee, which was the last full council before removal. So there's a lot of cooperation. There are 3 official bands of the Cherokee. There's the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Cherokee Nation, and then the United Ugula Band of Cherokee. Those are the 3 federally recognized. You have to be really cautious. There are so many Cherokee tribes out there that are so illegitimate, and just phony. But there's a close relationship now between EBC. Yeah. Now, right now, it gets complicated. Right now, Cherokee Nation and United Ugula Band are at each other's throats over casino money and police. So they canceled the big gathering. They're also in Oklahoma. And hopefully they put that in place. Yeah.
How far south did the Moravians?
Sorry?
Moravians?
How far south?
They went all the way down to Alabama. They started a school at Creek Pack with a young woman named Catherine Brown, and she had barely worked with the Moravians. She was more of an ABCFM person, but they kind of helped support starting that first. So that was more of a group thing. But yeah, they went all the way down to Alabama, and then they opened a second mission. I can't pronounce it. Joe, something like that. So they had 2 missions total. One of the things the Moravians really resisted was day schools because they wanted the kids to be important there. The ABCFM, they wound up working pretty closely with the Cherokee, and so they wound up starting day schools and impacted a lot of Cherokee kids. Because we had a lot of Indian parents who said, "I'd love for my kids to go to school, but not if I have to leave them. I'm not willing." And the other thing that I really try to hammer home with my Cherokee high school kids is when Charles Hicks and James Vann came together and said, "Hey, J. Ram Steiner, yeah, let's bring your school, let's bring this mission, teach our kids English." One of the things that it's always amazing to me that people don't seem to make this connection. When Charles Hicks said, "Teach our kids English," notice he didn't say replace our kids' language. This was a bilingual goal. The idea here was our children would still learn and know and be fluent in Cherokee, and they would be able to be fluent in English. So it was an add-on, not a replacement. But of course, the missionaries ran with that and said we can just replace this.
Well, this is funny because my wife's got a lot of ancestry. I'm Moravian. So far back, we lived.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. We
And
lived
again,
a half
home
a
was
mile from
Moravian.
Bethania and Bethapple. We lived right there. I had an 8th grandfather buried at Bethapple.
But the Moravians get from good records.
Oh,
my
excellent,
God,
excellent.
We had a guy give us paperwork, but it is
Yes,
so
Lord.
interesting to hear that because of how. So they spoke German most of the time. Their missionaries were teaching English, not German, because she.
Later, there were English-speaking Moravians. was
Right,
just
I
years
understand that, but I
generations.
didn't know what language they kept, like in the tap or the thing was, because we found my ancestors that have tombstones that are in German,
Yeah.
that
Oh, yeah?
Royal Hall just above the house.
Well, they're at Luton.
Okay,
If I
yeah.
can jump in, the ABCFM, we spent way too much time with the records, but the ABCFM sends their weakest missionaries to natives in the U.S. because they know they're going to be easiest to convert. They're ones who are college educated and multilingual, go abroad, and understand things. And they differ from the Catholics, Catholic missionaries, particularly Jesuits, who were required to speak at least two, if not three languages before they came over. They were much more likely to let them speak their own language and become bilingual because they saw the value of bilingualism. But the ABCFM and the Baptists and the Methodists, they were monolingual themselves, so they saw it as the language of Bible language. They stuck with that.
And what do you-
Another question I've had a student ask was, what if the Catholics come to the church? Like, would they probably still be speaking Cherokee English? Whatever language the Jesuits were. Because some of the Jesuit dictionaries are still used by groups today, particularly in Canada, because they were so careful linguistically. And they were told, learn the language, learn the culture, then translate the Bible. ABC of their missionaries had 6 months to translate the Bible when they walked to the society. How do you translate a book with metaphors of the Bible into language?
And what's ABCFM?
American Board of Commission for Foreign Missions.
Okay.
So
And
they
they-
ran for 120 years.
And they, you know, saying they didn't even want to send missionaries to the native people anyway. They came under a lot of political pressure because they were doing all kinds of fundraising and they were sending missionaries to India and to Hawaii and to all across the globe. And they started to get pushback of, well, why would I give money to you for over there when right on our frontier we have these needy, people who need help. And so under a lot of pressure, financial eventually as well, they decide, okay, you know what, we better go down there too, just to check a box. So yeah, they weren't, which is ironic though, because they sent some of the best missionaries and some of the most important missionaries, like Samuel Worcester is an ABCFM missionary, and he shows up, he's probably almost as responsible as Buckwati and Sequoia for the Cherokee Renaissance that happens prior to the movement. So
And his daughter
it's
is
great irony.
the first translator and they're fast. That was written in history language. The ABCFM was lured by the Civilization Fund, which is the federal government offered to create missions. But they also had the first corporation registered in New York State. So they were a corporate entity and they were a business. And that people forget. They wanted to convert people, they would sell them their things, their products, all of that. My first book has an entire chapter on the finances of mission systems, and it's pretty crazy how they're building this up. They expected the Indian population to convert faster, and so therefore they would buy more products that would support the ones that weren't going to convert as easily. And remember, in places like India and China, the missionaries could target pariah groups or groups that were excluded from the mainstream. You don't have that yet. So, in India, they encouraged
caste
pariah and Muslim people and gave them rules of immigration.
You also had what drove a lot of the missionaries nuts is the Cherokee have always been brilliant at syncretism. Just brilliant at syncretism. So Cherokee, Pope John Paul II used to say American Catholics were cafeteria Catholics, that they took their tray and went along and took the dogma that they liked and left the rest. The Cherokee were great at that. So they would listen to missionaries and say, yeah, I like that, I don't buy that. And of course the missionaries were saying, no, you have to buy it all. It's all or nothing. And the Cherokee were saying, I don't know. Like they went to the Cherokee and said, we need a word for forgiveness. What would be the Cherokee word for forgiveness? The Cherokee go away for a while and they're talking, and finally they come back and they say, we have no concept like that. The closest we can come is a phrase that means, okay, it's all good, let's sit down and drink. To which John Gamble was just mortified. Absolutely not. Talking about the forgiveness of our Savior. We don't have that. So that picking and choosing, missionaries hated it.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
And they did it themselves.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the things that fascinates me is none of the Protestant missionaries I studied, and I studied all the groups, none of them translate the Old Testament. They only translate the New Testament.
Really?
That's a biblical scholar at Davidson College. But the Old Testament is about tribal people moving towards kingdomship, moving towards all of this. Like, they just wanted them to pay attention to Jesus. So the part that would have made sense, they just ignored. Because I would look at these Bibles at the Newberry Library, and they all start with the New Testament.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute.
It makes you wonder if, because the Old Testament is also about oppressed peoples and the struggle of oppressed peoples, it makes you, because they made that mistake with slaves, right? And Moses became a real problem for a lot of slave owners. So I just wonder if it was
No, I
like,
mean, but it predates some of the stuff with slavery. You know, so it's, I don't know, nobody's ever sort of dug into that. We should
yeah.
here's an idea. But it is kind of, they don't do the Old Testament, still they're talking about the parts. They really go after this Bishop Whipple, who's Anglican in Canada, who writes this, again, some of you might have sung, in the Wintertime, for the Anglican, Episcopalian, and the Presbyterian churches. Because he says, the Arctic peoples, some Arctic peoples, have no idea what a camel or a sheep is. So these metaphors are orthodox to these metaphors, and boy does he get no, Bible is sacrifice. For someone who's lived in the Middle East and has sheep in my backyard, I'm kind of insulted that the Bible uses sheep. Because they're really not the brightest animal. So I'm like,
Well, it is calling all of us sheep, so, you know.
yeah, if we had the whole thing that fig trees actually produce 3 or 4 times, there's so many times in the Bible where it's like, if you like the fig tree, produce fruit. But 3 different times in 3 different areas. What do you mean by that? Yeah, so, but there was never sort of this cultural Jesuits who were better at playing that game. They were putting Native peoples decorate churches, Presbyterians, Methodist, Baptists, not look like that.
Well, if the Jesuits were a kinder, gentler missionary, then who were the Catholics in Canada that where they ended up with murdered indigenous people?
No, I mean I don't mean to be dismissive.
I mean that was the Jesuits,
That's
right?
the Jesuits and the Oblates and the Dominicans. I mean the other thing that somebody has not done a good job of is one book that's sort of comparing boarding schools for Irish children and boarding schools for Native children. The problem in the 19th century is that boarding schools in general in England and France and places had a very high. They treated children, the strong will rise, the weak will die. They treated all children. So in English boarding schools, they had a death rate of about 5%. The kids who died of pneumonia or other things. And so the Canada ones, they're no worse than the ones in the US. So my husband, plus, he's been married 35 years. He's lived with me talking about this stuff. He's been on a research trip. When the story about the Canada schools broke, he's a political scientist. He turns to me and he goes, I'm really glad the US didn't do that. I'm like, you see that show before?
Right, right.
You know that class I teach every 3 years called boarding school? You know, like, where have you been on this? And for my friends who are Canadian scholars, they were shocked that breast made such a big deal. They know they would have been children. Died in most of those boarding schools. We know that the records of that happened. We know that people were triple buried. We know, as historians, we know that published.
And the, I was going to say, sorry. Boarding schools, Jesuits,
Dead children.
dead children. Oh yeah, the sorry, the pedagogical foundation for all of that was a guy by the name of Joseph Lancaster, and he started this thing called the Lancastrian system. And just what you're saying, it was not for native schools. It was the top of the line, most well respected approach to teaching kids in the Western world. And when you read his book, it is horrific. You know, like tying kids' legs together so they could only walk like this if they had been bad, making them carry a big log around their neck that they could barely move with. You read it and you can't believe that anybody would read it and go, oh, that'll be great for my classroom. But they did. And so he was the heart of what the missionaries did in their, if they had any training. That's the irony. If they were professional educators, this is what they did. Now you have somebody like Anna Gamble, the Moravian missionary. She did that cafeteria thing. She took some of the Lancastrian stuff, but she rejected all of the physical and mental abuse. She went nowhere near it. As far as her husband John, we know he whipped at least one kid, because Anna writes about it, how devastated she was and how awful it was. But does not seem that the kind of physical abuse that we hear about later doesn't seem to be
When the Cherokee built the Cherokee Seminary, they rejected that. And my father went to boarding school in England, boarding school in the 1930s. Every morning they got up and they swam in the ocean, and they had to walk in their underwear a mile back to the school, no matter the weather. It's tough enough. And he used to tell horrible stories like, no, keep the doors at night, because that makes you weak. That was the 1930s. So it's, he was scarred for life, right, too. And so it's neat theories. But the Cherokee Seminary, one of the undersold parts of Cherokee history is after removal within 10 years, they have a male seminary, female seminary, a central bank, an entire school system. No other culture I know of, after having their life, Germany doesn't read down that fast. France doesn't read down that fast after World War II. But
the southeastern white Americans that moved in didn't set up a school system. That, matter of fact, I've been to Georgia. I'm not sure they've set one up yet.
I'm sorry. Sorry for so many questions, but what is your take on the Lumbee? Like, they're not federally recognized. So what is your take on that?
I try not to. Because it's still,
is that a controversy you don't want to get into?
It's really hard because, like, my ancestry is Eastern Cherokee, and we know where they stand. But I'm also the American Indian Student Group advisor where I work, which I can't mention, but where I work. So a lot of my students there are Lumbee. Sorry? Harvard.
So it's complicated.
It's really horrifically complicated. You mentioned how do you become a tribe, and the Cherokee, and it's not just the Cherokee. Most of the other federally recognized tribes are against this because the Lumbee do not meet the criteria. And so they would have to get special dispensation to become federally recognized. There's a lot of fear that kicks open the door to a lot of fake Indian tribes.
Gotcha.
God, you would not believe like how many tribes
I get that there are illegitimate, but I have empathy for the Lumbee.
Me too. And I think
I think the first one, because Elizabeth Dole doctor, so Congressman and you know all this stuff. Elizabeth Dole did that. And I actually almost backed into someone when I heard it on NPR. Elizabeth Dole just stood on the floor and gave them, because their schools are failing, and then they're going to tell them behind. The federal government was going to have to come in with the money. I federally recognized them they could access the American Indian education system. And then it stopped. Because after that point, the simple answer is the way you prove your Lumbee or Cherokee or whatever is you have to have written records that identify you as such all the way back at least 150 to 200 years. But when people like the British are saying those Indians over there, it's very hard.
Yeah.
And they write Cherokee when that's not how they call you such. When they call you Lumbee, when you identify as just war. When they call you Cherokee, when you adopted Yamasee after they had been crushed by war. It's not linear. And none are, if anybody's ancestry, an ancestry.com has taught us that it is. Right? So that's where the problem is. I'm sorry to jump in, but they give a very slim, they can get some federal money. They can stall on the next 2 months.
And so first of all, there's the colonialism issue, having to prove you're an Indian to the government that did everything possible to erase Indians. Having to show you have a language to a government that did everything it could to erase languages. in the EBCI right now, there's less than 200 fluent speakers of the language still alive, and 75% of them are over the age of 50. So the language it's this close to being extinct. What happens to the Cherokee if we don't have language in it? Do we lose federal recognition? So it's complicated. The cynical truth, however, is it's almost all about money for both sides, which not surprising.
You have a minute and a half.
Yeah, to change it here, I've got some loose relationships with First Nations people, and I was told that there was some kind of document that was presented by the broader network of First Nations that's been sitting at the federal government waiting for a president to publicly announce and sign on behalf of the American government in all our history of the process of First Nations. To acknowledge it and to kind of just as a way of saying, man, we mess up. And this is not going to be in any way to fix what happened, but a public announcement of what happened. Maybe starting with Thomas Jefferson, and supposedly it was presented to Obama, and then I was told Trump got close to signing. Can you comment on that?
I don't know about it.
So, I have one question. First Nations is not a term used for Native peoples in the United States. It's a term used for Canada.
Okay, that's odd, because I was with the group BBC, what they call themselves in the
But, and I don't know.
what, 20 or 30 different tribes.
Now, do you know that Biden, when he made the call to a federal national site in his last season, his presidency did issue a statement recognizing the horrors of the residential school and policies. And some people thought that was his way of it's not anything wrong declaring it. I don't know.
Yeah, this would be, and again, I just happened to be somewhere where this event was going on, and I was opposed, so I'm a fly on the wall, and I'm like, oh wow, this is really kind of a big deal.
I don't know what an organization was that uses the term First Nations, but I do know that there's been a push to try to get a Human Reconciliation Commission going in the United States, which is not succeeded. And there's some cold feet about what happened in Canada with Indigenous school in Canada. Seemed like a good idea. There are two really excellent Canadian broadcasting companies podcasts on First Nations issues and the importance of it. Some people are concerned that the Human Reconciliation Commissions re-traumatize people by having them publicly give testimony about what happened to them, et cetera, so, and some people feel like it has to be involved. The problem in the U.S. is that the federal government made a deal with the Catholic schools here that they would protect them from lawsuits if they would make, in Canada they would protect the Catholic Church from lawsuits if they would make the records publicly available. In the U.S. they can do that. Your choice, you can hunt the records and stuff if you want. So, and the federal government just pulled the funding from the Genoa School Archive in Parliament Bay, the Jesuit Archive in New York, just a month ago, to prevent them from doing anything. So we are way behind Canada. Canada is talking about their residential schools. We are way behind.
It wasn't specific to schools. This is now kind of a curveball question back to Cherokee. Talk about the casinos and the gambling and that how would you put that in perspective, not only in Cherokee but in other areas that essentially is a handout to say we're giving you this tool. I'm not ready to help give you a handout.
Yeah, well, luckily nobody did hand up or hand out with the casino because that was all driven from within, the tribe itself. In terms of what do I think about it, new dialysis center, brand new elementary, middle, and high school. Council house has been refurbished so that it has cameras, so that our elders, if they can't make it to the council, they can sit at home comfortable and they can watch tribal council from their homes. If you are a Cherokee child now, there's youth, you get accepted into college. The Cherokee will pay every penny of your tuition. They will also pay for your room and your board, and you will get a living stipend while you're in college. Now, you must maintain a certain GPA, and if you drop out, you must pay every cent back to the tribe. So if you don't complete your diploma, you owe the tribe every penny the tribe spent in your education. Right? It's pretty fair to me. So as long as you are doing your work, then college education. So the casino has been an absolute miracle. It's been a blessing across the board. The things that people were afraid of, in the 90s, the gambling addictions haven't swept through the community. Now, as far as the people who come to visit, I don't know about that,
Trade-off for help.
I was just saying, I don't know that I care that much, to be honest with you. We see it as rent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It is rent. So it's just been unbelievable. Basing your entire economy on one thing is very dangerous. For the last 30 years, it has paid off beautifully. Now we've got a Catawba casino in Kings Mountain. Now there's a new casino in Danville, Virginia. It seems likely that Georgia is going to allow a casino near Atlanta. We're talking massive, massive economic disruption for the Eastern Cherokee. Massive disruption. 30 years I've been hearing diversify the economy. We've never done it. We talked about it, but yeah, it's human nature. We need to look out for a rainy day, except the money's just pouring in. So, but it's the next decade's going to be with gambling online now being wide open. It's going to be tough. Now, the reservation has the bonus of being, sorry, it's not a reservation. The boundary has the bonus of being Cherokee. A lot of people like to show up, gamble, see some natives, buy some tacky, souvenirs. So the tourism piece is still here, but I am worried about the casino. The monthly income of the casino has gone down every month since COVID. So what are we at now? 4 years of that? So it's been phenomenal. I'm a little nervous about the next 7 years.
Cherokee casinos serve alcohol.
It does.
So some of the ones we have on the west do not serve alcohol.
Right.
And they tap into perhaps, evangelical Christians who like to gamble with
That's
evangelical Christians who like to gamble but do not like alcohol. So I lived in Minnesota, the Turtle Lake Casino does not serve alcohol, and they have a day camp for their kids. So while you gamble, your kids go to Ojibwa school and learn how to be an Anishinaabe. And it's become wildly popular. And there's a person, Hal Rothman, who passed away from ALS, but he was studying how the native casinos made Las Vegas become more family friendly.
How what now?
How the native casinos made Las Vegas become more family friendly.
Oh.
Because so many of them would not allow alcohol and started these cultural centers. They attracted families RVing across the country and stuff. And Vegas didn't like that, so they created, look at Paris and Venice and all that. So I've not been to the Cherokee Casino yet, so I didn't know if they serve alcohol. But Turtle Island, Minnesota does not serve alcohol, does not have shows, it's a right way for, and when my husband and I went very different population of casinos. So they tapped into that, but they are also now competing with 4 other casinos in the Twin Cities area.
And it turns out there's only going to be so much gambling going on. I mean, it's going to cash out for 30 years. But now, luckily, they made the brilliant decision to team up with Harris instead of just trying to fly it alone for the new casino. And so they've got the foundation of Harris, the expertise of Harris, kind of the insurance policy of Harris. So I don't want to make it sound doomsday-ish, but I'm nervous about the competition and what that's going to mean. Because the community has gotten used to doing some really wonderful and wonderful things for its members. So it makes me nervous.
Well, even Sun as one of the top investment firms, so they've diversified that. But not everybody's
Sorry, I didn't think of that.
That's okay, but we'll stick around for any more questions while the rain is kind of coming to an end. Because anybody has to hit the road before it picks up again, and then we'll do that others who are maybe